Hello friends, welcome to the Childfree Connection. I was recently invited to the Unleash Love podcast and we had a deep conversation about child-free life. We dove into my personal story, society's view of the child-free, and how we can work towards a place where child-free people receive empathy, compassion, and understanding of their lifestyle. If this is your first time here, I'm Veronica. My partner Rick and I create child-free content here on YouTube and on our Instagram page, so be sure to follow us there too. As you watch the interview, I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback, and I'll also be happy to answer any follow-up questions you may have. Okay, let's get right to it. Enjoy. So we only launched our YouTube channel about 4 months ago. So it's a fairly new project. We've talked about it since last year. Originally, what happened was in 2020, obviously it was a really challenging time for parents and kids. And we kept getting this, people would be, you two are so lucky. You don't have to worry about X. You don't have to worry about Y. You don't have to worry about Z. And we always find that comment to be so interesting because we're child-free by choice. So it wasn't luck that brought us here. It was a decision, and a decision that took quite a bit of time to make, and a choice and a lifestyle that we chose. So we really just started to have a lot of conversations about what child-free life looks like for us, not obviously just during the pandemic, but in general. And I really started to diving into the research because I'm 45 now. And I figured that I had so much pressure and judgment and criticism during my 20s and my 30s. But my assumption, which is, assumptions are not necessarily correct, and we talk about them in our videos as well. My assumption was that it wasn't looked at, that times had changed, right? Because there's so much acceptance with people's choices. So I assumed there is no way that women, people, couples can still be feeling the pressure and the criticism for not having children. It has to have changed. It has to be more accepted. And the more that I dove in, the more that I read blogs and books and stories and heard what people had to say, it made me realize that although decades had passed, not a lot had changed when it comes to that, especially globally. And it's also, I thought it was going to be geographic as well. I thought big cities, people who live in big cities, everything is so much more accepting, but that's not necessarily the case. So Rick and I were talking about, okay, I think we want to get involved in this conversation. And what we want to do is advocate for choice. We're not trying to advocate for this lifestyle. We're advocating for choice. And what can we bring to the table? And what we could bring to the table is to show people, I'm 45, he's almost 50, what our life looks like at this point with no regrets, with lots of fulfillment and lots of joy. And we thought that would be really beneficial because when we were in our 20s and 30s, there was no one that we could look at and say, oh, that's really interesting. That's where they are in their journey. So we decided to launch a Childfree Connection.
Nice. Okay. Thanks for explaining that. And I've got loads of questions for you. But just to kind of preface this conversation, you mentioned the Childfree Connection. What is it? And what's, so the goal is really just to kind of like what you've just said is to bring about more awareness as to this kind of lifestyle.
Yeah, it's to bring awareness. It's also to connect people. And obviously, because of the pandemic, we haven't been able to do as much as we want to do as far as the connection part, because I think a lot of people are a little bit tired of the virtual experience and they're ready to get together physically. The number one pain point that we see in this community is that they don't have other child-free friends. So it becomes really challenging, especially in your late 20s, early 30s, when all your friends start having kids. You tend to get you're not really in that circle. You're not getting invited to the birthday parties. You're not getting invited to the get-togethers because you don't have kids. So people feel very alone. So we wanted people to feel less alone. And we thought, let's start growing this community. And as the community grows, we do have a lot of plans on how to bring everyone together, which we're not ready to talk about yet because there's so many options and we're trying to focus on the best one. But connection and making people feel not alone was one of our priorities.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I'm 38 and I don't have children. And it's not because I don't want to have children. It's just because I haven't gotten to the point where I feel like that's an option for me. But I can see how different the people are when you become a parent. You are almost like immediately categorized and put into this kind of group of people, and you have to adopt, because it's kind of like it's an instinctive thing. You adopt a different way of looking at the world. You're no longer thinking about just you. You've got to think about what the best is for the child. And so it kind of puts you down this path. And me being single not single anymore, I just got into a relationship, but me having been single, not having any children, and 38 years old, mixing has really started to change over the last 5 years or so, where I've met more and more parents at my age. And I just don't know how to connect with them because we don't have the same interests. It's funny. I mean, this is just one minor observation, but I think it's quite funny. I usually, like when I was, in my 20s, my early 30s, when I would meet someone, usually they wouldn't have kids if they were my age, and we would just talk, and it would be fine. We would have a good connection, and then as soon as I started mixing with more parents, I started to notice little changes in interactions. Yeah, like they would be half there and half not there because their brain is also thinking about like the kid, and it's so it's a striking difference. So I can get the whole community thing. I think that makes a lot of sense.
It is. And people feel, we actually did a video on this on will you lose your friendships when they start having kids? And the thing is that I completely understand. I understand that once you have a child, you have different priorities. You have a different focus. So even if we get to the point where we can actually have a brunch, which probably took 3 or 6 months to plan to get together, your phone is, you're getting text messages, you're getting phone calls. You have a limited window of time because you have to pick somebody up, you have to drop somebody off. So the lifestyle is so different between the two that the connection tends to absolutely be disrupted. It just happens. But what is good, what I have found is now that most of my friends have children that are not young, they're teenagers, they're either in high school or they're off to college, the friendships that really matter, the ones that love you no matter what, do come back, and they do start because it's now they have the time, and now they have time to just not talk about their children, but they have time to focus on other things. And it can be sad for some people to lose their friends. So that's when they, like you just mentioned, absolutely start looking elsewhere for a community that can relate to their current lifestyle.
Right. Yes. And I'm already thinking ahead, and I wonder what are the reasons for you specifically that mean you'd rather not have children, and also what kind of experiences have you had with the people around you while you were explaining yourself, let's say, because like you said, it hasn't been a normal thing. And we can understand that, right? I mean, we're talking about essentially the next generation of humans, and I think every human has a stake in that. So that's why I probably see a lot of judgment calls from people who aren't even in your own family. But yeah, tell me a little bit more about
or in your family. Actually, that's actually quite the most common.
Yeah, which is why I'm interested in how your parents have if they're still around or not, how they had dealt with that so far.
I got quite a lot of pressure from my family to have children. And to be completely honest, one of the reasons that I was not 100% sure that about launching the Childfree Connection is because I still felt that, I still, at 45 years old, I still felt that twinge of shame of, them telling me, why haven't you had a kid? This is how you're going to find true love. You're going to regret it. All these comments that came at me pretty much my whole life. So I'm very familiar, which is why I can so openly and so honestly talk about it, because I'm so familiar with those comments and that pressure and that criticism. The main reason that I decided not to have kids, definitely for me personally, was lack of desire. I wasn't that child that was playing with baby dolls and dressing them and trying to play mom. I didn't foresee myself. I wasn't excited to be pregnant. I wasn't excited. When I envisioned my life, it wasn't with having kids around me. And it doesn't mean that I hate kids. A lot of people don't like kids, by the way, and that's perfectly okay. I happen to like kids. I love my niece and my nephew so much. They are such a big part of my life. I love my friends' children. I'm actually super motherly, which people find to be odd sometimes, but I'm just a mama bear by nature. I'm very caring. I like to take care of people. If you're sick, you definitely want me around because you're going to be taken care of so well. And that's just who I am by nature. But just because I'm motherly doesn't mean that I necessarily have to have my own kids. It was just something that I realized wasn't for me. It wasn't something that I was pulled towards. It wasn't something that I felt that I needed to have in my life for complete joy and fulfillment. But on top of that, because when I was in my 20s, lack of desire wasn't really an accepted reason. And I feel that people definitely do not need to list out their reasons of why they're not having kids, especially if they're not comfortable with it. That's just who they want to be and the lifestyle choice that they want to have. But when I was younger, it was questioned so much. So I happen to be a very analytical person. I do a lot of research, and I, for myself, had to really list out all my reasons. I wanted my time. Freedom was important to me. The ability to be spontaneous was important to me. Finances were important to me. I had this notebook where I broke down how much children cost, how much high school was, college. I just really dove into it deep. And for me, the only reason I did that, and again, nobody needs to do that, but I did that because I wanted people to understand that this was a decision that was really thought through, at least for me. Some people actually know, and we get some of our audience members giving us messages from the time they're kids, they already know. From the time they're 10, they know. 18, they know. 20, they know. So it's just not in them to become parents and it's so clear. So there's really no decision-making process. There's really no need to build a list because they just know from day one, which is really interesting as well.
There's a lot of, I guess, parallel social issues that are happening right now around the basis of like individualism and freedom of choice. I don't need to, or want to make this conversation about those things, but there are parallels to the whole abortion, which I think I can understand why it's still an issue. Although I personally feel like in this day and age, it shouldn't be an issue. And also, to other social, kind of movements that are happening right now where people want the ability to be able to choose what is best for them. And so I totally understand this. And it brings into question You know, a lot of things. I think the first thing it brings into question for me is, and I was thinking about this while you were explaining all of that, is this the first time in the history of the human race where we are actually making these decisions consciously? Because, like you said, prior to this generation, our generation rather, I'm 38, more or less our generation, right? It's kind of like it was just a way of life. It wasn't even a question.
It was an assumption. You meet somebody, you get married, you buy the house, you have the baby. There was just all these steps lined up for you, even with work, right? Work has changed so much. Before, if you switched jobs, it was frowned upon. You know, you wanted to get that 30, 40, 50-year gold watch or whatever it is that they gave people back in the day for being in a company for so long. And now people want to be on their laptops traveling the world. So it definitely has changed greatly. And you're absolutely correct. That was set up for us. So it was never presented to me as a choice. I knew inside that it's not what I wanted, but it wasn't because society had presented it to me as an option. You can be a parent or you cannot. It's completely up to you.
Mm-hmm. I don't see an issue with it at all. I think that it's really, something that is not going to harm other people in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Another parallel you kind of could make is the whole gender dysmorphia conversation, and I see that as having different implications, right? So if you may say, so people already know. There are people who already know that they're female at the age of 10 when they're male.
Absolutely.
However, with that whole argument, there is a physical component to it that is irreversible. And so if they do make a mistake and they weren't entirely sure when they thought they were, then that has serious implications later in life. So that's a really very important decision to make, I think. Whereas with, your own children, yes, you could change your mind. Absolutely, 100%. That's my own opinion, by the way. You can definitely change your mind, and it may be too late for you. But I do not see that it's as, I guess, damaging as changing your gender physically at the age of 10. So
and it's also important to note that, people can just Google it because there's so much information out there, that for some reason there is a correlation between choosing to be child-free and changing your mind, but there's not a correlation between parenting and changing your mind. And there is quite a bit of data out there that show parents have regretted their decision to have children. But for some reason that's not spoken about, and I guess the obvious reason is because people are going to be judging you if you're saying you're not really thrilled about having your kids. Right. So it's taken some time for people to come forward and to feel comfortable about it. But what's interesting is I spoke to a family therapist a couple of weeks ago who works specifically with parents. And she was telling me that one of the main problems that people have about raising their kids when they're really struggling is that she has this conversation with them in the beginning and they say to her, I didn't really want to have a baby, but so-and-so, my mother wanted grandkids. My partner really wanted kids. So it's really interesting to look at it that way, because regret and changing your mind can really be a part of both stories.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. The devil's advocate approach that I would take to that statement is, I think there's a lot of things in life that we don't want, but then at the end of the day, we find out it's kind of what made us grow, or what took us to a new level of living that we previously just couldn't understand. We couldn't even fathom it. And so I think there's definitely a good argument there to say, well, it may be in your best interests to do it, even if it's not what you want right now. However, I can also see again, coming back to the whole individualism, and maybe it's the first time in the history of our race. Again, I don't know. I would love to know this, so I might do some research after. But I think even in the times of opulence in history, like the Roman Empire, for example, I believe that having a kid was just the way it was going to be. Like many kids, actually, even right. But I think it's possible, and I don't know what your thoughts are about this, but I think it's possible that we've reached a stage where, the choice really should be yours. Like we don't struggle from that anymore. We're actually overpopulated. The planet is arguably suffering because of the resources that the human race is consuming at an ever-growing rate. I can't remember what the statistics are, but by 2050, we're going to have a much bigger population globally, and that will be an issue going into the future. So I don't know what your thoughts are about that, but
okay, so just a quick side note here. If you're enjoying this interview, please take a moment to like this video, click the subscribe button, and hit the bell so that you get notified each time we release new content. And also, we're working on a bunch of new developments, so be sure to visit our website and sign up for the Child-Free Connection Now alerts so that you are in the know. Okay, back to the interview. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I've talked to quite a few people who are child-free by circumstance, not by choice. And that's a completely different journey in itself. But what I find interesting is that, at least the conclusion that I've come to, is that it's really about our source of joy and what we're taught that our source of joy is. So sometimes a couple or a person might find that their source of joy is having children. And once they find out that that's not available to them, it does. And I can completely understand how that could feel so draining, and that there's not going to be any other type of joy coming your way. And I think that people feel that about relationships, like they can't find joy until they're in a relationship, or they're not going to find joy until they work their way up and they're CEO of their company. So there's different forms of joy for everyone. But the people that I've talked to that are child-free from circumstance have found that they were putting all their joy eggs in that basket. And then once that basket was no longer available to them, they had to go through this journey within, because joy really lives within us, right? And see that there's actually other parts of their life where they can find joy. And that's where their healing has begun. And I think that's really just an important thing to note as well, that joy means different things for all of us, and it's just not one source.
That's a very good point to make. I have been running this through my mind as you've been discussing that, and I want to ask you about what you think of the possibility that we are in a bubble in time, where we are potentially sowing the seeds of a future issue, if we're not careful, of just maybe drawing ourselves more into individualism. And look, this is a pretty deep topic, but it's something that I really try to understand, because it's so difficult to see it for what it might be right now, because we're in it and we can't see the bigger picture easily. But I have noticed that there is a move towards more liberal, progressive ideologies across the globe, where arguably it's good because people have more, are supposed to have more freedoms and rights, although that might not necessarily be what's happening. But the goal is to have more individual freedom and rights. Whereas traditionally, we've kind of functioned more as a community. And that meant more conservative values, where we would put the values of the community or the importance of the community before ourselves. You've kind of touched on, it's the whole, hey, you do your part. You have your kids, you raise your home right, and be part of the community, the system. But the reason why I bring it up as a bubble is because I think it's really interesting to see how much we've moved from one side to the other, and how quickly we've moved from one side to the other. And I think it's causing a lot of friction with the systems that are in place, like the government and the institutions, and just a general culture. It's just a huge shift. And I think it's bringing with it a lot of problems too. And we're becoming very divisive now. We're kind of like fighting each other over these principles and the ideologies. But do you think this is just a bubble in time? Do you think that it's kind of gonna? Do you think that people like yourself are a product of society at large? Like, for example, you kind of settle into the freedom of choice. Because that's what you've kind of grown to see as the world, whereas generations before maybe didn't even look at it that way. They were just like, "This is what I got to do. This is life."
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a big part of what you just said has to do with the idea of being selfish, and the idea of being of having self-love and self-care being packaged into the world selfish, and turning selfish into a negative personality trait for so long, I think is definitely really meaningful, because taking care of yourself, you're mentally, spiritually, just doing your best to provide yourself with growth and self-help and introspection, in my opinion, is huge, and should not be seen as something negative, and should not be seen as something outside of the norm, outside of what you should be doing. Because I think that having the freedom to look within is what was lacking before, just like you said, because everybody was following this cookie cutter way of doing things, and you weren't really given the autonomy to dive into yourself. Do I want to get married? Do I want to be a homeowner? Do I want to sit behind a desk all day? Do I want to have children? And that's part of being selfish. It's part of being like, what is going to bring me what I need out of life? And that was seen as such a negative trait for so long. And I think that shift is really meaningful. And it's something, when people start to think about themselves and be proud that you've spent this time thinking about yourself and what's best for you, is really what's foundationally making a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Arguably, you could say that by giving yourself that space to explore the universe for whatever it's worth, right? And not have to devote those important resources that you have, time, energy, money, to someone else or some other huge responsibility, opens you up to give so much more of who you are and what you're able to bring to the world.
100%. And so much of our audience, it's interesting because although they don't have their own children, they're very much involved with children, either by being teachers, by being volunteers, by just working with children therapists, just working with children in different ways. And I think it's really beneficial for children to have child-free people in their lives, because they're not having these conversations under the parental umbrella. They're able to, I mean, even with my own niece and nephew, I'm able to have different conversations that they can have with their parents. And that's crucial, and that's really beneficial to children as well.
Mm. Although I must say as well that the argument can be made, which is why I said argue at the beginning, that by having that responsibility, all of a sudden you're catapulted to another level of goals and achievements. And you hear it over and over again, at least I have, that just the fact of knowing that you're going to be a dad or a mother is almost like a call to action. It's like, okay, I got to get everything ready now. I got to get my shit together and focus. And so there's different ways of looking at this. But, if you are the kind of person who has a direction, who has clarity, knows what they want, and decides not to have kids, arguably that is freeing you up to do so much more. I know people who, I love these people. I respect them greatly. I just get this feeling based on the experiences that I've had with them and who I know them to be, that they choose not to have children because they're simply not open to the idea of the challenge. They want to relax. They want to, and that's okay. I don't have a problem with that. But I think that is another outcome of this, is that without that clarity and that purpose, it's really just a sandbox for just relaxing and being, free to do whatever you want. And I can see why the community kind of politically right people would say that that's selfish, in a negative way.
Right. I mean, it depends, right? Everyone's so individualistic in what they decide to do with their time. But the sense of wanting to avoid responsibility, I actually have a real issue with, because it basically is saying that responsibility is measured by taking care of children and raising them, and not by, there's a slew of other things. For example, a lot of our audience is taking care of elderly family members. They're taking care of very ill siblings. They have very high pressure jobs. They have pets. They have the sense of responsibility is actually at such an overwhelming level that adding to that doesn't feel like something they want to do. So it is very individualistic, because you can also argue that a couple that has children but is wealthy enough to have all the childcare and full-time nannies that they want also may not be taking on the responsibility of raising their kids, and leaving it up to somebody else to do. So it depends. It really depends on each person.
It seems like a cookie cutter response, I guess, just like many other subjects and topics receive cookie cutter responses as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, you have to be really thinking about this topic. And another reason that we launched a Childfree Connection is because we wanted to hear from our audience, and the individual stories are what really take us deeper into this topic, because we learn about.
It makes it real.
Yeah, it makes it real, and the things that we've heard are things that would never even cross our minds. People being completely shunned from their families because they've opted out of parenthood. The parents aren't even talking to them, or their siblings aren't talking to them.
How's your relationship with your family?
Oh, I have a good relationship with my family now. They've accepted it. And it's actually ironic, because my mom now is at the point where she completely, she'll be like, I get it. I get it now. It's a lot of responsibility. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of financial pressure. So she's definitely at that point. I think my sister and my brother-in-law, I'm 45 now, so the pressure has subsided. Absolutely. But I moved from Because I think between 40 and 45, I mean, the pressure was so great in my 20s and 30s, but between 40 and 45, I was getting the it's not too late, because more and more women are having children between 40 and 45 now. So I was getting that. Now that I'm crossing over into the 45 and 50 range, I don't get it's not too late, but I'll get, well, you can always adopt. And it's really interesting to me because those comments to me seem like I have a problem that I need someone to solve. Like you're offering these solutions to my problem. And I just find that to be quite interesting. And don't get me wrong, adoption I think is beautiful and something great, and I'm all for it. But it's just interesting, right? That now that's what I moved into. And I talked to someone who's in their 70s who's child free, and this is something I had never thought of. And she tells me people tell her, "Oh, you're missing out on the grandkid experience." So even though she feels super fulfilled and happy in her life, she says that as we get older, every stage, just the comments change. They remain, but the actual comment just changes. So it's interesting.
You'd think in this global situation with the overpopulation that I mentioned, that this would be something that is actually welcomed rather than kind of shunned. And there are situations where limiting or not having children enough will put entire nations at risk. I'll just mention a couple. Japan had that issue for a while, and I guess they still have that issue actually, where people just weren't having kids. And I think it all really boiled down to the economy was stable. And there's a correlation between poverty and the number of kids. If you didn't know that, and if people who are listening didn't know that, generally speaking, the poorer you are, the more children you're going to have. And the proposed reason for that, the most popular one, is that there's less chance that some of them are going to survive. So you want to make sure that there's some kids that carry your genes through. But so what we're seeing is with the more financially well-off nations, there's less children per household. And Japan had an issue with that and still has an issue with that. There is a developing situation in China, which is going to potentially put them at a huge disadvantage economically, whereby the one-child policy that was practiced for quite a while had actually significantly reduced the number of family members, and has put them in a position where they're now really trying to encourage families to have more kids. So I think that's an extreme, because it's an extreme way of looking at things. The Chinese situation, because that was an imposed law, that was a rule that was put in place. It was like either do this or get fined. But it's interesting to me though that we're still looking at this as something that we want to judge negatively. And you're right, coming back full circle to what you were saying, is we don't think about these things enough. I think critical thinking is just we always come back to critical thinking as being that skill that is just in dire need, because we're so emotional, right? Human beings, we're so emotional, and we let those emotions govern how we make decisions, which is why perhaps the world is in such a terrible, in many ways in such a terrible state. But if we were to just be able to practice those critical thinking skills and work on those critical thinking skills, I think we might come to much different conclusions.
I agree 100%. I think critical thinking is key. And I also think that a big factor is empathy. And that's something that is lacking throughout, not just with this topic, obviously, with so many things, because I can understand how a parent who has a child and is so head over heels with their child, with their children, cannot fathom the idea of not having them in their lives. So when they are talking to someone else whose choosing to opt out of that experience, it can't connect, right? Because they're in it. Their heart, their soul, their mind is in it. So I don't necessarily think that it's always coming from a bad place. I think that in their minds, they're like, how could you possibly miss out on what I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing? But it's hard for them to understand when someone else perhaps never wanted that, or perhaps has trauma to heal on their own, that they don't want to be in that situation, or a slew of other reasons. So I think empathy could really help with the issue of divisiveness between child free and parenting. And I think that we've had some negative comments from parents that even though we're so clear in our messaging, in our social media, in our YouTube channel, whenever we speak, that we're not anti-parents, we don't hate kids, we're not trying to convince people to make the decision not to have them. That's absolutely not what we're about. Even though we say that over and over constantly in all our messaging, we'll still get parents upset because they feel that we're against them, that we're trying to get people to not have kids. And I actually just had a message from one of our followers. She sent me a DM that one of her friends, they've been friends for 20 years. And this person who sent me the message was sharing some of our social media posts in her story. And her friend of 20 years reached out to her and said she feels very attacked and she no longer wants to be friends with her. And it's so interesting. That attack word is so interesting. And that really has to do with divisiveness, right? Because we're taught, pick a side and stick to that side and defend that side no matter what. And if somebody's not on your side, it must mean that they're against you. And I just find that whole dynamic so interesting, because even if you're clear, if you repeat yourself, some parents are going to feel attacked. And that's really something I've been thinking about a lot and really diving into. I just find it really fascinating.
Well, I mean, if you want to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. Is one of the sayings. There's always going to be someone who is upset with the way that you live, because they identify so greatly with their way of life or their views or ideologies. And that is essentially the problem, isn't it, behind political divide? It's well, if you don't believe what I believe, then you're against me, and you're taking something from me. That's actually really, it's something that I've experienced too. And I'm learning somehow to deal with it. You said that you're fascinated by the whole thing, so it means that you're probably very open-minded to and empathetic towards people like that, and trying to understand how to deal with it. I try to understand how to deal with it too. We haven't actually had a ton of negative messages, not like, because you're taking a very solid stance here on a controversial subject, whereas I like to touch on controversial subjects but not make it our identity. But it's something that, if we're going to evolve, and I think this is a really important thing to take into consideration, if the human race is going to evolve, the irony is, in this particular niche of this issue, the irony is that it's not going to be whether or not we want to have kids or not. That's not the issue of whether we're going to actually be able to advance as a humans. Because I truly believe more people want to have kids than people who don't want to have kids. I think we are biologically geared towards just wanting to replicate. That's obvious. However, so therefore, I don't think it's ever going to be an issue. If we give people the option openly to just choose, I don't think we're ever going to have an issue with not being able to advance as a civilization. However, I think there is a real risk in us being able to do that if we're not able to empathize and see people's perspectives and not feel threatened and attacked. I think triggered and attacked are two maybe aspects of the same problem that we're currently experiencing, which is, I mean, how would I even summarize this? It seems to be a lack of responsibility to take a step inward and confront the things that make us the most scared, the things that we fear the most. Those are usually the things that drive these defensive behaviors and these victimization kind of beliefs that, oh, it's up to someone else to make me feel better. It's up to someone else to craft this world in which I live. Otherwise, what am I going to do about it? So I don't know what you think about all of that, but I just thought it was interesting how the irony is that in this particular subject, the issue isn't with giving people the option to choose whether they want to have kids or not. The issue, it really is, I think, more to do with our ability to get along with each other, essentially.
Absolutely. And there's so many examples of experiences that people have where they're put in a position where the other person is refusing to have empathy, to understand their choice, to open themselves up for something different. Another example, recently we had someone reach out to us because they decided to be child-free by choice. Her parents will not accept it. She's married, will not accept it at all. And she recently was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and her parents told her that God is punishing her for choosing not to have children. And that was really powerful to me and those messages really mean a lot to me because it just motivates us to keep talking and to keep educating and to keep advocating and to keep having these conversations. Because at no point, obviously, should anybody be feeling less than because of this choice. And sometimes, and we get messages from people as well saying, nobody cares about this. Everyone can do what they want to do. There's no way that people can actually be saying these things. And it's because they don't experience it themselves. But when we get these types of messages of people having these real life painful moments based on a decision that they've made to opt out of children, it really shines a light on how prevalent it is and how important it is to understand this lifestyle. And it also comes back to what we were talking about earlier, the sense of community, because one of the things that she said was that she feels so heard and seen and understood by by our account and the people that comment on it. And it's unfortunate what people are experiencing right now, but hopefully things will change as time goes on.
Yeah, it's just so sad to hear that your own family would say something like that.
It's heartbreaking. I spent a couple of weeks. We were gonna do a quick video on it, which we ended up posting on social media because I couldn't even talk about it because I cried every time I talked about it. So it took me a couple of weeks to just be able to like ground myself enough to tell the story on social media. And what Rick and I did was, we were like, what can we do? There's very little we can do. So we just did a video and we told her story and we said, if you want to comment below, if you want to show any support, if you want to, drop a heart, whatever you want to do. And the community came flooded forward with support for her. And she was, she sent us a message, which I haven't actually shared. I just got it yesterday, of how during her chemotherapy treatments. She's reading all these messages from our community, and it's just making her feel so much better because unfortunately she's not getting the support that she needs from her family right now.
Mm. It's shocking to me. I'm not going to say this is the reason, obviously, but the way that I understand health, there's a real good chance that that was actually manifestation of just that stress of just the constant onslaught of, I mean, the body works in very interesting ways. And a lot of our health is to do with our environment and our thoughts and what we're feeding ourselves, not just physically, but also mentally and emotionally. So I wouldn't be surprised. And it's so sad and unfortunate, but good luck to her. I wish her the best. I hope that she can put herself in a situation, in an environment, and at least have people around her that are going to be supportive, because it's so essential. We hear about this sometimes, from maybe spiritual or personal development teachers who say, you got to manufacture an environment where the people around you are not leading you to feel worse. They're actually picking you up and pulling you up and making you feel like you're more of a person, more capable, more able, and you've got something of value to offer. And I think family is one of those things that is a very difficult ingredient in that, because you can't easily get rid of your family, and nor do you necessarily want to. But there's situations where you definitely should set boundaries, right? And this is maybe a good example of that, because that doesn't sound healthy at all.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And this also goes back to the idea of community, because we do get messages from parents saying this account is dumb. Who cares? You just want to talk about the fact that you can go to brunch, that you can do this, that you can do that. And it's really, I've thought about this so much. It's so interesting to me how some parents will see this as wasteful or as dumb or as a problem. But if you really think about it, there are millions of parenting websites, mommy blogs, shows, social media accounts that are for parents to support one another during different stages of their parenting journey. And my answer back to them is, why is that okay? And us talking about our lifestyle not okay, or dumb, or a waste of time, or a waste of a social media account. So that really, and a lot of times I don't get an answer back when I because it's just baffling to me. And another thing that I tell people is that there is a difference. We talk about celebration of child-free life. That's part of our core mission. And sometimes child-free living is seen as quote unquote bragging, right? Because I have the time to sleep in. I have the time to go to brunch. I have the time to get a massage, to focus on myself, to read a book and lay on the couch and do all these things. And I'm confused as to why that's bragging, because that's actually a reality of our lives, and that we're just celebrating, just like parents celebrate. How many times have we seen a baby bump, from the time the woman becomes pregnant to 9 months? We've seen every week, right? We will get an update. How many times do we see for kids' first walk, first meal, first apple, first this, first that? Why is that not bragging? Why is that seen as celebration? And that's something I've thought about extensively as well, because we should all be celebrating our choices and not putting a label on someone else's celebration. So I encourage our audience all the time to not feel that you're bragging. You're actually just celebrating something that you took quite a bit, perhaps, to choose.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that. I think it reminds me of the comments that I made in a group on WhatsApp with friends that I met in university, and they're all married now. Most of them have kids. I think there's like one couple that doesn't have kids in that group, and I'm apart from me, and I'm making these comments about me going to this country, and I'm meeting these people, and I'm dating, and I'm having fun, and I didn't honestly just genuinely didn't think about it before I published.
Yeah, you're sharing your reality. Right.
Exactly. So, but then I got some pretty unsavory comments and remarks, and it dawned on me. Uh, oh, they're being passive aggressive because they're married and they have kids and they don't do this stuff anymore. And these are guys, right? So me talking about going on a date with this woman here and a date with a woman here, yeah, it's probably going to feel, I would say, it's probably going to bring out emotions that maybe are no longer welcome. And yeah, I understand it. I get it. It's difficult. It's so difficult to be open-minded enough to be all right and supportive of that when you're going through, maybe a shitstorm with a young child, and you're waking up every night and you're having problems in your relationship because there's no passion anymore, or you know what I mean. These are real adult problems, and they require a lot of work and patience, and you get frustrated and angry. So I just wanted to share that because it's funny you mentioned it there. It's very difficult to get to that point where you're like, yeah, you go for it, enjoy your life.
Right. Exactly. Absolutely. Just because the lifestyles are so different. I actually talk quite a bit about Rick and I work on our relationship a lot. And when we have a problem, we really have to dissect it and dig into it. And if we can't figure it out, we bring in our couples therapist. Like we have this time to talk about, okay, something's wrong here, and we can't figure it out, or we need to do something different, or something needs to shift. And that takes quite a bit of time and effort and energy. And that's something that we feel very grateful for, that because of our lifestyle, we have that time and that energy to put into our relationship. And absolutely 100% not to say that parents do, but speaking from my personal experience with some of my friends, when they're telling me that there's a struggle or there's something they can't figure out with their partner, and they just absolutely don't have the time to handle it or to deal with it because there's so many components of their children's life that they're trying to manage simultaneously. And I could 100% understand how you can't just like go off on a couples retreat to try to like find your issue and solve it and all that. But it's not that one is better than the other. It's just that it's different. So I always say we as child-free people should not only be grateful that we have this time and that we have this freedom, but definitely not feel shame for it. Because when a parent tells you, I've had throughout my life, people tell me, what are you going to do? Happy hour, brunch? Like, is it a massage? What are you getting this weekend? And I'm like, actually, yeah, we're going to the spa. But you do get a little bit of, these little comments and I've thought about it a lot. I'm like, it's okay. And that's what we tell our audience, to share your reality. It's just different. It's not better. It's not worse. It's just different.
Listen, if you're the kind of person who's going to make snideish remarks like that, then it means you're not at peace with your life. It means that you haven't accepted your circumstances, right? I mean, how could it not mean that, right? You're bitter. So when you're bitter, it means you're not in alignment with the choices you've made in life. And so perhaps this comes full circle to what you were saying about there's a lot of stories out there that just don't get shared of how people perhaps regret having had kids and or getting married to the person they got married to. That's another taboo subject, right? I wish I hadn't, done that. I wish I'd had more relationships and met more people and been more sexual. whatever it is. I think there's a huge responsibility on the individual to, well, I think there's a responsibility the individual needs to take for the actions that they make in their lives. And the moment we don't take responsibility for it is the moment we start to get jealous, bitter, resentful, all of those terrible human emotions that are very corrosive, not just to your own life, but to the people around you. I mean, those are what lead to bad decisions. And
Yeah, absolutely. And as a child-free woman, I can absolutely see the joy that parents experience. When you see those beautiful, sweet, loving moments that I see with my friends and their kids, and I know I'm not going to get those moments. So it really goes both ways, right? Like there's plus and minuses, or there's different experiences you're going to get with one lifestyle and not the other. So it's important to acknowledge that there's a difference. Again, one's not better than the other, but there's going to be some experiences that I will miss as a child-free woman, and there's going to be experiences that a mom will miss as a parent that I'm having. So really, it's just a matter of what's best for each one of us, because both are so different.
yeah, I mean, personally, I think it's a blessing to have a child, to be able to have a kid. A lot of men out there can't have children. A lot of men can't. Their sperm isn't going to work. So, we forget that easily. I think I've made the mistake sometimes of not being sensitive to people who are childless, and not really thinking first before I say something, and then you realize that they can't have kids, and you're like, oh my god, that was not a good thing to say. So yeah, it's a blessing. So if you're bitter about it, basically what I'm saying is, maybe take a good think about your situation and look at it from a different perspective.
Right. And there's many people that will argue that it's absolutely not a blessing for them.
Little shits.
And so, it just depends. That's why we're all so different, because some people will look at, a person who has 5, 6 kids, look at their morning, compare it to their, to their day, and look at both and just be so thankful that their day doesn't look like that. So it depends where the blessing is, depends up to the person.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think we've done a good job of kind of hashing this out, and I've learned a lot, actually. You've really opened my mind to another way of looking at passing our genes on. Have you ever read the book, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins?
I haven't.
Well, it's an interesting book, and I don't think you need to read it, but it's one of those, it's an evolutionary biologist who's kind of explaining the reasons why humans make certain choices and decisions, and it's largely based on passing our genes on.
Yeah, legacy.
Yeah. And it helps us understand the motivational forces behind a lot of culture. So I recommend that book to people if they want to try to understand a little bit more about this whole challenge of just getting around, like why it's such a kind of like an obligatory thing for a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's also interesting. It's different for example, Rick hasn't received a lot of the comments and the pressure and the judgment that I received as a woman, and that's generally tends to be the case. But what men do hear quite a bit, and what he has heard throughout his life is legacy. Don't you want to leave your name behind, your DNA, your, someone who looks like you, someone who, and it's really interesting how that's viewed and how that's questioned. And he's been very open and honest about the fact that it doesn't even cross his mind, never did. And he doesn't feel less than in any way because he's not leaving a little him behind. Because legacy is really interesting, right? Because there's quite a few child-free people who have passed on and left a really significant legacy. If you think about, or even people that are alive today. Like if you think about Oprah, let's say she doesn't have a child and her legacy is huge. How she's changed the world, what she's done with her school.
Do you know what her reason is? I don't know.
Yeah, for her, I think it was, I don't want to say because I can't remember off the top of my mind and I don't want to give wrong information to your audience, but she has always come to me as an example of leaving a legacy behind that's not necessarily your biological child.
She wants to leave she wants to leave an empire. She's always struck me as that she's that kind of role model that you look to when you're trying to figure out like, how can I be successful? That's Oprah.
100%. And she's also a great example of someone with her school in Africa who doesn't have her own kids, but has been so impactful in the life of children, which is what I said before. A lot of our audience are doing exactly just that. So leaving behind a legacy to me doesn't necessarily mean leaving behind a mini me. It means leaving behind, it could actually be a variety of things, but I think that opening up to what exactly legacy is something also that people don't think about because there's quite a bit of opportunity there.
I think the worry really is that you're not going to live vicariously through your offspring. Your gene will disappear. When you think about that logically, it doesn't make a difference because you're not going to be alive anyway.
Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, logically speaking, there's so many humans on the planet that you could actually make the argument that having your own kid is selfish because you could just adopt. You could have 2 kids that you adopt, and you would alleviate the orphan problem by 2. So having a school, teaching kids, not having children of your own, doing whatever you can to alleviate this issue of like parentless children around the world and suffering is quite a noble cause. That could be a poster child for the whole I don't want to have kids movement, because essentially, you're working on a problem that can't be solved by having more kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think it's interesting when people talk about this topic of legacy is that the assumption is that your child is going to be this really wonderful, functioning, emotionally intelligent member of society. And I don't think that anyone's going to be surprised to learn that that's not necessarily the case every time. So although that's the hope, that if you are doing a good job as a parent, obviously that's the hope that you're going to get. But there are no guarantees that is exactly what's going to happen. So whatever your idea of this unborn child that you have in your mind may not necessarily match what the reality is going to be. So it's just, it's a lot to think about. It's quite interesting.
It's a huge topic, and I feel really unprepared and uneducated to cover more. But I've covered a lot of the stuff that I feel I could bring to the table. And I think for anyone who's listening, hopefully they've gotten a good sense of the arguments from both sides. Like, again, I still understand why having your own kids is really important, and it's just a natural thing for a human being to want. But I now have a newfound understanding. Yeah, right, for some. But I have a newfound respect and empathy for people who don't. And I can thank you for that. So I appreciate it. How do people join this community? How do people get in touch with you? And
Yeah, absolutely. So our YouTube channel is a Childfree Connection, youtube.com/a Childfree Connection. We're also very active on Instagram at the Childfree Connection. But what we're telling people now, because Rick and I are in such development process right now, is to go to our website, thechildfreeconnection.com, and sign up for our Childfree Connection Now alerts, because that's where we're going to be emailing people and letting them know what we're working on, what's coming in the future. And, especially with, Instagram and Facebook going down this week, like that's it's really crucial that that people sign up so we can keep them in the loop of all the interesting and exciting projects that we have coming up in the future.
Yeah, did you also experience that then? So that was a huge eye opener for me when everything went down. I immediately felt, firstly, the first response that I had was withdrawal symptoms. So I was clear that I was an addict, right? And then the second thing that I realized was, holy shit, I'm relying on these platforms way too much.
Mm-hmm.
So I hear you 100% on that. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, and maybe we can catch up again in the future as your organization grows.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your openness to the topic, and thank you for letting me speak on it. It's really important to me that people start seeing both sides.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe today and you won't miss the next episode. We cover topics like recovering from infidelity, online dating, managing chronic anxiety, and so much more. We're on all the popular platforms, so take your pick, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you for watching, and don't forget to comment below with any questions that you may have. I will be happy to answer them. And if you want to dive deeper into other child-free topics, just check out these videos here. We thank you, we appreciate you, and we're excited to see you next week.